The battlefield did not fall quiet. It merely changed the way it screamed. When the last clash of steel faded into the evening wind and the bodies lay in tangled rows of mud, blood, and shattered armor, the men who still breathed were dragged back into a world they did not recognize. Victory, despite oaths and banners, never felt like triumph. It felt like accounting. And on that cold field of churned earth and ruptured flesh, the victors began their grim arithmetic. The air itself seemed to curdle as the sun dipped behind the hills. What hours earlier had been a frantic eruption of terror and violence had turned into a heavy silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the dull thuds of soldiers flipping corpses to search for survivors or valuables. The ground, soaked through with men's final moments, glistened like a dark mirror holding the last light of the day. Across the field walked the victors, not in celebration, but in evaluation. Every fallen foe was examined, some with reverence, others with indifference. A noble's armor gleamed differently even under grime, and the men tasked with gathering the captives quickly learned to look for embroidered hems, gilded pauldrons, or rings that clung stubbornly to swollen fingers. Where they found such treasures, they also found value, and value was life. For now. The common captured soldier, meanwhile, learned a cruel truth in those first minutes after defeat. The battle was over, but he was not safe. Rough hands seized him by the arms, twisting them behind his back. Many could not stand. They were forced upright, pushed forward, driven by kicks and curses. Some begged, others offered no resistance at all, staring blankly at a world that no longer belonged to them. And then came the sorting. Under a makeshift pavilion built from torn banners and broken lances, officers of the victorious army arranged themselves like merchants preparing to inspect wares. Prisoners were dragged forward in uneven lines, each man casting a desperate glance toward the soldiers behind the table, hoping for mercy, fearing the opposite. Names were shouted, ranks demanded, origins questioned. Those who bore noble blood were separated immediately, ushered toward a guarded enclosure, where their bruises were cleaned and their wounds bandaged, not out of compassion, but investment. A nobleman alive was a purse waiting to be opened. A nobleman dead was a lost fortune. The rest were herded into a different fate. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of beaten, blood-soaked warriors were pushed into cramped spaces, bounded by only the simplest barriers. Ropes stretched between stakes, old wagons overturned to create walls, or even piles of corpses forming temporary partitions. The stench was overwhelming. Sweat, blood, iron, fear. Men coughed until they choked. Some fainted, others clawed at the earth, trying to dig for water or an escape route even though neither existed. Within hours, disease had already taken root. A soldier with a deep gash in his leg convulsed as fever took hold. Another, his eye swollen shut, whispered prayers that dissolved into murmurs before fading altogether. The guards noticed, but did nothing. Dead captives needed no food, no water, no pay to oversee. Death to them was a cost-saving convenience. Night fell slowly, as though reluctant to descend upon the carnage below. And as darkness crept across the field, the victorious soldiers lit torches, their flames turning the battlefield into a flickering inferno of orange light and wavering shadows. The prisoners flinched at each silhouette that crossed the fire's glow. Some thought the executioners were coming, others wished they would. Among the captured, panic built like a storm. Men whispered of what might come. Some had heard of mass executions, the kind done to thin the burden on marching armies. Others feared mutilation, the severing of hands or ears as warnings to any who might bear arms again. A few clung to thin hope. Perhaps they would be ransomed, exchanged, or even spared. But hope in a medieval war camp was a fragile thing. The guards walked among them, counting heads, striking down those who resisted. One man lunged in desperation and was cut down instantly. The blade that killed him barely slowed. His body was dragged aside like waste. And yet, even in the midst of misery, there were rules, ancient, unwritten, and inconsistent. A prisoner who declared his noble lineage might be spared, even if it was a lie, for long enough to be proven. A man fluent in multiple tongues might be pulled aside for questioning rather than punishment. A skilled blacksmith or carpenter could be recognized by the marks on his hands. Even captors knew the value of craft. For the rest, nothing was certain. As the torches hissed in the misty night air and the cold settled into their bones, the prisoners realized their fate would not be decided by bravery or honor, but by practicality. They were no longer warriors, they were resources or burdens, and those categories would determine whether they saw another sunrise. A commander approached the enclosure, his silhouette long and sharp in the firelight. His expression was unreadable. Behind him followed scribes with wax tablets, guards with iron rods, and men who carried coils of rope. Every captive straightened, every breath caught. Tomorrow, the commander said, decisions would be made. And as the night deepened, as the wind carried the smell of blood and torches burned low, every man in that enclosure understood the same terrible truth. Surviving the battle had been the easy part. When the clash of steel finally faded, and the battlefield fell em silencioso sob o peso de corpos e poeira, os prisioneiros eram reunidos como restos de naufrágio humano. They stood in uneven lines, shivering from exhaustion, fear, or the cold wind that swept across the blood-soaked earth. For them, the battle had not ended. It had only transformed. Soldiers from the victorious army walked between them, dragging ropes, chains, and wooden yokes used to bind those who were unlucky enough to survive. The conquered were not treated as men returning from the brink of death. They were assets, burdens, or opportunities. Each soldier, noble or common, became an entry on someone's ledger. Those marked as valuable, the nobles, the banner knights, and even the better-armed men-at-arms, were separated first. Their armor, once shining symbols of power, was stripped from their bodies, not out of humiliation, but because the metal itself was worth nearly as much as the man. Many cried out as they were forced to walk barefoot, their pride shattered long before their bodies. The common soldiers, however, faced a far harsher fate. Many were herded like livestock toward makeshift enclosures, wooden fences, rope boundaries, or even simple circles drawn in the mud. Guards surrounded them, but the true walls were hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness. Disease often struck before any official judgment did. A single infected wound could kill dozens. Contaminated water could erase half a camp overnight. The captors didn't need weapons to thin the ranks. Time and filth did the job for them. Nightfall was the true trial. Under the open sky, without tents or fire, the prisoners huddled together like animals trying to conserve scraps of warmth. Sleep was shallow and haunted. Any twitch, any whisper of movement could bring a spear to one's throat. Guards were always nervous, always quick to act. But within that misery, politics thrived. Merchants traveled with armies seeking profit amid despair. They appraised prisoners like livestock, noting scars, muscle mass, age, and potential obedience. A strong back could fetch a handsome price. A skilled artisan, especially a blacksmith, was a treasure. Even wounded men could be sold as long as they could lift something heavier than their own shame. A prisoner marked for sale was considered fortunate. Others were doomed to forced marches. Columns of exhausted men were dragged across miles of ruined countryside toward distant fortresses, work camps, or foreign markets. Many collapsed along the way. Their captors rarely stopped. Escape attempts were constant. Some prisoners slipped away during storms or in the chaos of supply caravans. Others bribed guards with promises of hidden wealth, family heirlooms, or fabricated noble lineage. A few daring souls attempted to flee in bold daylight, trusting that confusion, terrain, or sheer audacity would grant them a few precious breaths of freedom. But the consequences of being caught were brutal: mutilation, execution, or binding in irons so heavy one could no longer stand upright. Yet perhaps the most haunting fate belonged to the broken-hearted, the men who chose not to escape, even when the opportunity appeared. They had lost everything: brothers, fathers, commanders, belief. Their spirits had died on the battlefield, and their bodies simply followed instructions, obeying captors with hollow eyes that reflected nothing but ash. Still, in rare moments, humanity flickered. A guard offered bread, a prisoner shared water. An enemy recognized an old childhood friend beneath the dirt and blood. War was merciless, but the people trapped within its machinery sometimes defied it. And so, after the roar of battle came the quiet cruelty of captivity. a long grinding oppression far more personal than the chaos of combat, because swords aimed for bodies, chains aimed for souls. Not all captives were equal in the ruthless aftermath of medieval warfare. Some prisoners carried within them something far more valuable than gold, lands, or noble lineage: skill. And in a world where kingdoms relied not only on swords, but on the quiet genius of craftsmen and thinkers, a single talented prisoner could reshape the ambitions of an entire army. To a victorious commander, a captured blacksmith, siege engineer, carpenter, falconer, or even a literate scribe was not a burden. He was an asset, a living tool, a rare advantage. These men were separated from the masses long before the blood on the battlefield had time to dry. A life purchased by skill. Being useful spared a man from the crude pens where ordinary prisoners were shoved together like livestock. But usefulness came with a different kind of chain, a chain made not of iron but obligation. The captured blacksmith was escorted to a tent or workshop and ordered to forge weapons for the very men who had slain his comrades. Every stroke of the hammer became a reminder of his forced betrayal. Each glowing blade he produced could kill a friend he once marched beside. Siege engineers endured a torment even more psychological. They were interrogated, sometimes for days, about the weaknesses of fortresses they had helped build. They drew diagrams of walls they once swore to defend. Their knowledge, extracted by pressure or threat, could doom hundreds. Even scribes, scarce and highly valued, were claimed immediately. A man who could write with precision became the memory of his captors. He recorded treaties he did not believe in, chronicled victories he wished had been defeats, and kept accounts for a lord he would have once denounced. Tactus, rules, chains, and freedom in name only. In many cases, these prisoners were treated with an odd courtesy. They received better food, warmer spaces, and sometimes sleep without iron shackles. But this treatment was never kindness, only preservation. A dead artisan was worthless. A living one could shape an empire, and they knew it. The blacksmith was always watched. The engineer was never left alone near maps or gatehouses. The scribe's quills and parchment were counted meticulously. A craftsman prisoner lived well enough to work, but never freely enough to hope. Some were promised eventual release, but these promises were misty illusions, vague words spoken to keep a man compliant. Driusabo, a double-edged privilege. Yet for all their suffering, skillful prisoners were spared horrors that awaited the common ranks: starvation, disease-ridden pens, and mass executions. Their greatest curse was knowing why they were spared. They did not live because someone pitied them. They lived because someone owned them. For many, the weight of that truth pressed heavier on the soul than any chain could on the wrist. In the days that followed the shattering clash of armies, Europe seemed to breathe in a heavy, uncertain silence. Victory had been claimed, but the blood had barely dried, and for the thousands left alive, whether captors or captives, the ominous question of what comes next loomed like a storm on the horizon. Inside makeshift prisons and commandeered fortresses, the fates of captured warriors were being rewritten not by swords but by politics, economy, superstition, and the raw instincts of survival. The process of deciding a prisoner's future began long before any formal declaration. Every guard, every soldier, every minor official who came into contact with a captive played a part in shaping the path that man would walk. A noble in chains, for instance, was never simply a noble in chains. He was a walking promise of gold, alliances, leverage, or even revenge. His lineage became a currency more valuable than any chest of coins. Thus the victors wasted no time identifying their high-ranking catches. Heralds and scribes combed through the battlefield, matching battered coats of arms to family records, whispering among themselves like merchants evaluating precious stones. These nobles were taken to separate quarters, sometimes a tower chamber, sometimes a guarded manor. They were not treated with kindness, but with caution. The goal was not to comfort them, it was to preserve their value. Their wounds were tended, their food rationed just enough to keep them alive, their clothing replaced so they might appear presentable should negotiations arise. Many of these captives soon learned that silence was a strategic weapon. Every word spoken to their keepers risked revealing desperation or strength, either of which could alter the terms of their expected ransom. The most cunning nobles said very little. For the common prisoners, however, the landscape was different, brutally different. Their value was determined not by bloodline but by necessity. If the victors needed laborers, the men might be marched in columns toward construction sites, quarries, or farmlands devastated by the very war they had just survived. If labor was plentiful, these captives often became a burden too heavy to bear. Food shortages were common, and in harsh winters, pragmatism outweighed mercy. Decisions made in whispered conversations by low-ranking officers could become death sentences delivered at dawn. A third group of prisoners found themselves in a uniquely precarious position, those with skills that transcended rank. Blacksmiths, engineers, fletchers, and scribes were not merely spared, they were appraised. These men were interviewed at length, tested, even challenged. Their captors needed to know if their abilities were genuine or exaggerated. A man who claimed to craft fine blades might be handed a broken sword and ordered to restore it. A supposed engineer might be asked to identify weaknesses in a fortress wall. Whether they succeeded or failed often determined whether they lived another day. Prisoners who revealed themselves as useful were quickly absorbed into the victor's logistical machinery. A competent smith could produce the weapons needed for the next campaign. A skilled fletcher could keep archers supplied. A literate man could catalogue inventories or draft messages. They worked long hours, often under strict supervision, but they survived, and sometimes they even earned reluctant respect. Not all prisoners accepted their fate quietly. The most dangerous among them were the ones who studied their captors the way a falcon studies its handler. They memorized guard rotations, listened for arguments among their overseers, and learned the habits of men too tired or too bored to remain vigilant. Every opportunity, no matter how small, was a potential route to freedom. A fight staged between two captives might distract guards long enough for a third to slip away. A forged illness could lure a healer close, making his bag of tools an unexpected weapon. A sudden fire, a collapsed fence post, a cart left unguarded for a heartbeat too long, each became a spark that could ignite an escape. Sometimes the boldest escapes succeeded not through stealth, but through audacity. In a world without standardized documents or widely known faces, a confident stride and authoritative tone could be more convincing than armor. More than one captive walked straight through the camp gates by pretending to carry out an order, relying on the chaos and exhaustion of war to mask their identity. These stories, whispered later around hearths and taverns, became legends of daring and quick thinking. Yet among the prisoners, some chose neither rebellion nor despair. Instead, they bent to the winds of fate and sought new allegiance under a foreign banner. Pledging loyalty to one's former enemy was a decision that carried the weight of both survival and stigma. Rituals varied by region, but the essence was the same. The defeated warrior knelt, placed his hands between those of his conqueror, and swore service until death. For many, this was not betrayal, it was rebirth. Returning home meant facing families ruined by war, fields stripped bare, debts impossible to repay. By contrast, continuing life under a new lord offered stability, employment, and a new purpose. Some of these oath-sworn soldiers rose to prominence within their adoptive armies. Their intimate knowledge of enemy tactics made them invaluable. Their discipline, shaped by hardship, won them the respect of men who once might have killed them. A few even became commanders in their own right, sculpting their destinies far beyond what their original lives could have offered. Occasionally, the interactions between captor and captive transcended politics altogether. Shared interests, falconry, storytelling, card games, acted as unexpected bridges between men who should have hated each other. Over time, grudging respect could turn into genuine camaraderie. During long nights guarding prisoners in drafty chambers, tales flowed as easily as wine. A noble prisoner might describe ancient battles or forgotten customs. A common soldier might share jokes or memories of festivals from his homeland. Human connection slipped quietly into the spaces where fear once lived. These bonds sometimes altered the course of entire regions. A prisoner who dined with his captor might later serve as an advisor. How a soldier spared from execution might become a trusted scout. When these men eventually returned home, their stories reshaped perceptions, starting whispers that perhaps the enemy was not always the monster painted by propaganda. But such outcomes were the exceptions. For most captives, the road ahead remained lined with uncertainty, hardship, and the looming threat of disappearance, whether into labor, into servitude, or into the unforgiving earth itself. The battlefield was only the first test. Their true fate was forged in the days that followed, in the decisions of men who weighed lives like coins and futures like gambles. Dawn crept over the ruined horizon like a timid messenger, pale and trembling, as though afraid to announce the morning to men who had forgotten what hope looked like. For the prisoners who had endured capture, humiliation, hunger, forced labor, broken oaths, and nights interminably long, the promise of release was not a liberation. It was a riddle, because freedom in their world was never free. When the gates finally opened and the victors declared that certain captives could return home, the men stepped out, not as warriors reborn, but as shadows of themselves. Months, sometimes years of captivity had carved quiet ravines into their faces. The scent of the outside air, wet soil, grass trembling under the new light, was almost painful to process. Many blinked as though emerging from under deep waters. Others hesitated entirely, afraid that this final gesture of mercy was nothing more than another trick. The march back toward familiar lands was a pilgrimage of ghosts. These once fierce fighters now walked with steps measured not by strength, but by memory, each one more haunted than the last. They spoke little. Words had grown heavy in captivity. Silence had become their language. And as they crossed territories burned by war or abandoned entirely, they discovered that the world they left behind no longer existed in the form they remembered. Villages once bustling with marketplaces now lay in splinters, roofs caved in from raids or neglect. Farmlands left untended during the campaign had turned wild. What grain remained had been claimed by the desperate. Streams where children once played ran dark with runoff from burned timbers and forgotten bodies. Wolves, sensing human weakness, prowled with boldness they had not dared before. The returning prisoners quickly realized that the road home was not a path of joy. It was a re-entry into a world reshaped by absence. For those few who traveled in pairs or trios, companionship provided a fragile shield against despair. One would whisper encouragement when another stumbled. Some shared stories of their homes, though the stories sounded more like myths than memories. Others swore oaths to seek out families together, even if only one of them had someone waiting. Bonds formed in captivity were strange and strong. Older loyalties had been ripped from them, and what remained were the men who had stood beside them in cages, in fields, in endless nights. But the hardest moment awaited each man at his destination. The arrival. Returning to one's own home was a battle waged entirely in the heart. Those lucky enough to find their villages intact felt the sting of a different kind of pain. They saw neighbors who had already assumed them dead, children who no longer recognized them, wives who stared with disbelief before collapsing into tears, unsure whether to embrace the stranger or recoil from him. Parents who trembled, torn between joy and the dread of what their sons had become. Every reunion was a collision of grief and relief, and some men found themselves unable to step across the threshold of their own doorways, because they had changed more than the world had. Sleeping beneath a roof felt suffocating after so many nights under open skies or inside cramped pens. The crackle of a kitchen hearth made them flinch, as if hearing the snap of a torch carried by guards. A creaking floorboard sounded too much like a cell door opening. Even the laughter of children could rip through them unexpectedly, summoning memories of comrades who had died with no such comfort. Some awoke screaming, soaked in cold sweat, their minds replaying battles they barely survived, or tortures they endured in grim silence. Others wandered outside at night, patrolling their own farms like half-wild sentinels, unable to convince their bodies that the war was over. A few never fully returned to the rhythm of normal life. They became wanderers, drifting from town to town, searching for a peace they were no longer built to experience. Yet amid this torment, there were rare and shining moments of healing. A son gripping his father's hand, as if to anchor him back into the world. A wife who refused to let the darkness reclaim the man she thought she had lost forever. A feast held in honor of the returned, even if food was scarce. Songs sung around fire pits to drown out the silence left by too many dead. But even these sparks could not change the truth. Medieval society did not understand the wounds that bled without being visible. No priest had words for it. No healer had herbs for it. No lord offered compensation for minds shattered in captivity. These men bore their burdens alone, wrapped in cloaks of duty and expectation. And so many former prisoners forged their own meaning from their suffering. Some dedicated themselves to training new soldiers, ensuring that the next generation would fall captive less easily. Others turned to faith with fervor, believing their survival to be a divine test. A few sought out the families of comrades who had died, offering stories, apologies, or the meager comfort of truth. But the most remarkable were those who rose above the cruelty of their time, men who used their experiences to negotiate peace between rival lords, to advocate for more humane treatment of captives, to prevent future atrocities with the weight of first-hand testimony. They became unexpected voices of reason in a world built on steel and vengeance. Their scars, though silent, shaped the world more than anyone realized. For in that age of blood and banners, the fate of prisoners after battle revealed something profound. Not all wars were fought with swords. Many were fought in the minds and hearts of the survivors long after the last drumbeat faded. And while kingdoms celebrated victory and chroniclers praised heroes, the truest story lived in the quiet endurance of those who returned home carrying battles no eye could see. To survive the battlefield was to survive only the first death. To live afterward was to confront the second and conquer it inch by inch.